Hello nerds for Yang. This week's update. We are going to cover polls, betting odds, media stories, web searches, and social media growth. Packed week update. Before we get into it, if this is your first time to the channel or you've seen us before but you haven't hit that subscribe button, please do so. We've found out that I think 80-something% of people who watch these videos haven't subscribed. If you subscribe, you'll be the first to know when a new video is available. And also, the more repeat kind of long-time viewership we get, the more likely we get a chance to be recommended to other people who may be interested in politics or open to learning more about Andrew Yang, but don't know about the Nerds for Yang channel. So if you subscribe, like, and share this video, big thumbs up, thank you so much. We're at 2,000 subscribers-ish. Love to get to 2,500 after this video. Let's see if we can do it. Nerd power. All right, so let's get into it. For polls, we got a lot of work to do. We're still in the 1% to 2% range. There's some polls that show us at 3%, but the last national poll I looked at from Monmouth, released on April 23rd, has Biden and Sanders at 27 and 20 respectively, and Yang coming in at 0. Morning Consult also released a poll around the April 23rd, and that has Yang coming in at 2. If you recall, they used to have Yang not listed at all. Then he got to, I think, 1, so now he's at 2. So I think that's a encouraging trend. Obviously, we would love to see him more in the neighborhood of 4 or 5, which would be comparable to Booker and Beto, right under Warren. That would be fantastic. I think that would be a great goal to get to 5%. Well, we'll see if we can do that. It's still early. I did also look at some polls that are not national, because you could argue, well, you know, nationally across the country, people aren't really paying attention. They certainly are in Iowa and New Hampshire, given, you know, their historic first in the nation status. So with Iowa, the first caucus, you know, you've got Yang at 1%. That was released on April 22nd and done by Gravis. And you've got Biden and Sanders at 19 and 19, and Buttigieg strong third at 14, Harris at 6, Warren at 6, and then Beto, Booker, Klobuchar, Delaney, Castro, Gillibrand all in front. I don't know about Castro. He might be at 0, so he may not be in front. But a lot of work for Yang to do in Iowa, which is a little bit concerning given that we know that he's been working really hard. I think he's been to Iowa like 10 plus times. So hopefully some of the excitement we see on the internet will transfer to in real life in the caucuses when the time comes. New Hampshire, a little bit more encouraging. You've got Yang at 2%, with Sanders and Biden at 30 and 18 respectively. Buttigieg strong third at 15. And then you've got this like kind of cliff to Warren and Harris at 5 and 4 respectively. So in those early states, it looks like there's a few tiers. There's tier 1, which is probably Biden, Sanders, and Buttigieg. And then you've got the next tier, and all those guys are in the 15 to 30 percentage points. Then you've got Warren, Harris, O'Rourke in the kind of middle single digits. And then you got sort of the long tail with Booker, Klobuchar, Yang, etc. in the 1% range. So I think our goal would be, let's see if we can get Yang up to that 5% range in the early voting states to be more comparable to Warren and Beto, which isn't out of the question. So that's the summary of the latest polls. If you look at betting odds, you could argue that that's an even better kind of early indicator. And from a betting point of view, where people are putting money on this, of all of the candidates, Democrat and Republican, Trump is most likely at 42%. That's partly because he's the only, for the most part, Republican candidate, and we've spread out the Democratic odds across, 20 plus candidates. Of the Democrats, you got Yang coming in at 6, so 6 out of 20, not too shabby. Top contenders, according to the gamblers, would be Sanders, Biden, Harris, Buttigieg, O'Rourke, and then Yang. So you'll notice that, we've got Yang ahead of some other well-known candidates. Specifically, you've got Yang ahead of Warren. That's kind of a big deal. Booker, Klobuchar, Gabbard. But you also have him behind Buttigieg, Harris, Biden, and Sanders. O'Rourke is interesting because he's been dropping. He's at 6.3% chance of winning, down 2.5%. So if you continue to see Beto drop at that rate, you might see Yang pop into the top 5, at least according to the betting odds, which would be super exciting. Next, media coverage. So every day there's still a few Yang stories written, but not that many. You'd want to see him get to the 5+ range. What you could do as a Yang supporter, if you are one, is when you see a story written about the Democratic primaries and you don't see them talk about Yang, I would reach out to the journalists on Twitter or if they have an email address and say, hey, it's kind of crazy. I think that was done. Someone did that about an MSNBC story where they covered like all these candidates. And Yang is one of only 6 who has reached the minimum number of donors and absolute value of donations required to be eligible for the Democratic debates. So you could argue that if they're ever mentioning more than 5 candidates, that better be Yang. And yet sometimes they still talk about other candidates who haven't yet met that threshold. So let's assume positive intent, and let's just assume these journalists don't know enough about Yang and try and nudge them as directly as we can. So one other thing about this media coverage, I actually also dug a little deeper to look at the quality, not just the quantity of media coverage. So I went to Google News and I searched for each candidate, not all 20 obviously, but just some of his comparables. So Cory Booker, you see he's got stories, CBS News, CNN, Wall Street Journal, Salon. So he's got some pretty good stories around his environmental justice stuff, his 10 years of tax returns, his charitable giving. If you look at Klobuchar, CNN, Fortune, she just had her town hall, New York Times. So nice coverage there. If you look at Buttigieg, you got Washington Post, you've got USA Today, Reuters, Vanity Fair, The Atlantic, so no shortage of kind of heavy-hitting media coverage. I don't know about the Vanity Fair thing. I would hope Yang never gets on Vanity Fair. I feel like that's a bit of a curse, given what happened to Beto. And then you've got Yang. What are his stories? Next Shark, LA Magazine, Neiman Journalism Lab, U.S. Cannonberg Media, National Review. So even though Yang isn't getting as many stories, I would argue the caliber of stories he's getting is just not commensurate with what we all think is his potential. And so let's just keep working at it and letting those journalists and media outlets know when they cover other candidates and they don't cover Yang, they're doing a disservice. And we're not just sort of fanboys, because at the end of the day, when you look at number of donors, social media activity, web search activity, feel free to share this video with them. We'll go into why we think he's a credible candidate and deserves more coverage. So that's the media side. Now, if you look at web search, strong but not growing as much as we'd like. So let's look at web search nationally in the United States. When you compare Yang, Buttigieg, Beto, Harris, and Castro, Yang is this blue line. It's in the top 3, but you see those red and greens for Buttigieg and Harris really kind of jumping up. And obviously, we'd want to be in that pack. You also see searches for Castro and Beto pretty anemic. And, if you had to guess who might be the first to drop out after New Hampshire or by New Hampshire, you might think that Beto and Castro are going to be in the cabinet race, maybe VP. I'm sure they would say Yang would be in the similar category, but at least we're looking a little better on web search. Look at web search now filtered to early states. Let's say Iowa. It's pretty interesting. You see searches for Andrew Yang, really only about a third of searches for Sanders and about a sixth of searches for Harris. Almost no searches for Beto in Iowa. And Buttigieg 3 times more than Yang in Iowa, but not 10 times more, not similar to the gap in polling. So the Iowa web search interest seems to be much closer than the Iowa polling we've seen. And then if you look at New Hampshire, that's actually seems to be one of Yang's strongest areas for interest. He's got almost as much as Buttigieg. Only about 50% less than Buttigieg, only about 50% less than Harris, and about a third of Sanders. So if you were looking at this from a polling point of view, you would say, wow, Yang is right up there. Obviously, this is not polling, this is web search. Who knows whether this will be reflected in the polling results in the future, but it's certainly encouraging. Lastly, let's look at social. So if you look at Twitter followers, the big story is that Beto continues to kind of like soften. He had that massive surge in October of 18 and the end of last year. But then he's been kind of like, growing okay, but not that great. Whereas you see the red line is Yang. He's been growing nice, healthy growth ever since sort of early April, late March, probably the Rogan stuff. That was probably the big watershed moment. But then look at Buttigieg, man. That thing is crazy. He keeps growing, a little bit of softening. But if you look at the daily number of additions, you'll see Yang adding more Twitter followers every day than Beto pretty consistently, whereas in a few weeks ago they used to kind of alternate, and a few weeks before that Beto would always be growing more than Yang. So I think we see Yang on track to pass Beto, at least in terms of daily growth. But you also see Buttigieg 5 times more growth every day than Yang. So he's for real. If you were hoping that Buttigieg would be a flash in the pan, we're not seeing that. One last thing as a call to action is we have a change.org petition to see if we can get 60 Minutes to do a story on Yang. In some ways, I think he has just as interesting a story as Buttigieg. Yang's been really kind of pigeonholed as a UBI guy. He has a really great bio. I mean, he is the son of immigrants who moved here in search of a better life. Father worked at GE and IBM, 2 American kind of innovation powerhouses. His father was responsible for dozens of US patents. He's obviously gone to amazing universities and grad schools as a lawyer, as a successful entrepreneur, started a nonprofit, a businessman, and he's drawing support from both the Democratic Party, but also a lot of Trump supporters. That's a really cool story that I think 60 Minutes should tell. So if you agree, please check the link below for the 60 Minutes petition. If you've already signed it, please share it with your friends and followers as well so we can get more momentum there. That's it for this week. Next week, I'm thinking to do either another kind of round robin update, polls and searches and social and betting markets, or I could do a deep dive on frequently asked questions about UBI as an addendum to my previous UBI video about how we would pay for it. Or I could do it on a different policy altogether, maybe on environment or campaign finance reform. That would be kind of cool. So let me know in the comments what you'd like to see next week. And again, if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. The more subscribers we can get, the more kind of long-time viewership we have, the more chance of us getting shared and recommended by YouTube to other people so we can get the word out. I hope this was helpful. In the meantime, go nerds, go Yang, and see you next week. Peace.